European Union delegation here in London is co-hosting this event together with the Ukrainian Institute for London. I'm very honored here to work again and to have here with us this afternoon Olesha Kromeshuk. I don't know if that's okay. Okay, good. This is not the first time we work together. We've worked on quite a few events already, and even including this year. And it is a true honor to host this. We have a very distinguished panel that I will not introduce. I think Olesha and actually the moderator, Nigel Gould-Davies, will be introducing the panel, but we have a very distinguished panel with us this evening. I'll just say a few words, basically to express very clearly the support of the European Union to Ukraine, support in probably the most difficult times that Ukraine has lived as a nation, and that Europe is living as a continent since the Second World War, with the terrible war in Europe that is affecting the territorial integrity of Ukraine, its sovereignty that's under attack, terrible violation of the most elementary principles of the UN Charter. And this, in fighting back, Ukraine has the full support of the European Union and its member states. We've been supporting it in many ways. We've been supporting it diplomatically, we've been supporting it through humanitarian assistance, supporting refugees. More than 4 million Ukrainian citizens have found international protection in countries of the European Union. We are, of course, also contributing in different ways to finance to support financially Ukraine up to now, since the war started, and now unfortunately we come to a very these numbers games. It's going to be 1,000 days of war in Ukraine in just a few days from now. And up to now, the European Union has been assisting Ukraine with almost 122 billion euros. It seems a lot, but bearing in mind what Ukraine is going through, it certainly is only a modest contribution to a very important effort, where Ukrainians are paying not only financially and economically, they're paying with their lives, and I think there's no way to compensate for that and their suffering. So out of this 122 billion, roughly 41 billion have been macro-financial assistance, roughly 43.5 billion military support, and for the European Union this has been quite a departure from a traditional practice. We created an instrument that has been to be able to provide lethal equipment to partners in difficulties, and the first time this has been put to use is in supporting of Ukraine. So we are supporting it from the EU financial instruments itself, but also directly by our member states. We have created different funds also to assist Ukraine, and we are providing 17 billion euros to countries that are hosting Ukrainian refugees at present, and a number of the remaining billions in grants, loans, and guarantees. The most recent contribution has been a new loan of up to 35 billion that the European Union has extended in the context of a broader 45 billion loan provided by G7 partners. Another important way of supporting Ukraine, as you know, has been sanctions. We've developed already 14 packages of sanctions, and they are biting and making life more complicated for Russia, which is the main purpose. This includes individual listings, entities, and individuals. It includes also sectoral measures that target energy, finance, trade, and making it as difficult as we can to circumvent those sanctions. We have also signed with Ukraine joint security commitments. This was signed in last June by the Presidents of the European Council and the European Commission and President Zelensky to help Ukraine defend itself, resist destabilization efforts, and deter acts of aggression. But probably one of the biggest ways of supporting Ukraine has been by extending candidate status to Ukraine itself. And it is impressive how, under very difficult circumstances, Ukraine is undergoing and undertaking very important reforms to be able to integrate fully the European Union. And we're sure that the best guarantee and security guarantee for Ukraine is being a member of the European Union, and we're keen to welcome it. You would have seen, perhaps, although it was a bit dark when you arrived, we are flying a Ukraine flag in the delegation. This has been so for the last more than 2 years, and we will continue flying a Ukraine flag until the war is over and Ukraine recovers its territory. So this Europe House is Ukraine's house as well, and we are very privileged to support it. After that applause, I dare not continue, but I do want to say that also on issues of reparations and war crimes and accountability, the European Union is being very active in supporting Ukraine, supporting the Prosecutor's General's office, and supporting efforts by the International Criminal Court. And here, very important, the Ukraine's law now adopted in August that will provide for its ratification of the Rome Statute, as you know, the founding statute of the International Criminal Court. And so hopefully Ukraine will become party to the treaty on the 1st of January 2025. We're also supporting efforts on the establishment of a special tribunal for the crime of aggression. We're also helping in addressing issues on the establishment of a compensation mechanism, as well as in fighting against Russia's deportation and transfer to Russia and Belarus of Ukrainian children and other civilians. And we've been working with Ukrainian friends and partners and other members of the international community in addressing these terrible actions by Russia. And it is part of finding peace again in Europe that accountancy for crimes is effectively met. Finally, just to mention that we're supporting also Ukraine through a military mission. We have trained so far, I think it's close to 63,400 Ukrainian soldiers. We hope that we will train 75,000 by the end of the year. And we're also supporting, through an advisory mission, the efforts of Ukraine to ensure accountability for the crimes committed by Russia. I will stop here. I think you have, I'm sorry, I went even maybe beyond what I should have. Again, big welcome to all of you, big welcome to our panelists and our moderator. Big welcome, of course, but this is your house, Olesia, and I hand over to you for a few introductory words, and I'm sure that we're going to have a very interesting panel. Thank you all for joining us this evening. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Ambassador. Good evening, everyone. My name is Olesa Kromachuk. I'm the director of the Ukrainian Institute London. For those of you who don't know us yet, welcome. We are an independent charity that champions Ukrainian culture and shapes the conversation about Ukraine in the UK and beyond. And through our diverse program of public-facing events, much like this one, educational courses and digital content, we enable audiences throughout the world to access nuanced information about Ukraine. And as the ambassador already said, tonight's event is organized in partnership with the delegation of the European Union to the United Kingdom, and we are extremely grateful to their team, including in particular Adolfo Garcia Gomez and Andras Kos, and of course the ambassador himself, for hosting us here at Europe House. We've had a number of discussions held here in this absolutely wonderful space, and I am certain that this one will be just as fruitful. Now, today we are focusing on the question of impunity and accountability, in other words, justice. And justice is one of the themes that runs across all of the projects and events that we run at the Institute. On your seats, you will have found a piece of paper with a QR code that will take you to our latest issue of the London Ukrainian Review, an open access journal that we published together with the Institute for Human Sciences in Vienna and Academic Studies Press. And in this latest issue, published only last week, we focus specifically on the question of justice. And please allow me to quote two contributors from that issue. So featured in London Ukrainian Review, Nobel Peace Prize laureate Alexandra Matvichuk, in conversation with Maria Tamarkin, warns us that, and I'm quoting, "Everything that we are going through right now is the result of the absolute impunity Russia has enjoyed for decades. Russia has committed these crimes in Chechnya, Moldova, Georgia, Mali, Libya, Syria, and other countries around the world. If the demand for justice is not met, it may very well transform into a demand for revenge, and this perpetuates the cycle of violence." And she goes on to say, "One thing we have to do is end this stereotypical approach to justice, where the latter is considered unattainable as long as we are in the midst of war and massive human rights crisis. The world has changed dramatically, yet we are still looking at it from the perspective of the Nuremberg trials. But I'm challenging that norm," she says. "We already have new technologies which allow us to recreate events in detail, collect evidence, communicate with people living under occupation, and identify criminals. So the first thing we need is to overcome our own mental barriers and set ourselves an ambitious an ambitious goal," end of quote. And another contributor to the issue that I would like to quote today is Katerina Busol, whom we're very lucky to have as part of tonight's panel. And she reminds us, and I'm quoting, "Ukraine's civil society has already done many things that have seemed unimaginable. May that be an inspiration to take further steps for the rule of law and for humanity, domestically and internationally." And it's with these thoughts that I'd like to open tonight's discussion. And it's my great pleasure to introduce the moderator of the discussion, Dr. Nigel Gould-Davies, who is a senior fellow for Russia and Eurasia at the International Institute for Strategic Studies. Nigel, the floor is yours.
Alessia, thank you very much. And good evening, everyone, and thank you very much for finding time. I think, despite the perils of public transport this evening, to take part in this conversation on a vitally important and urgent subject. As the ambassador mentioned just a few moments ago, the 1000th day of this war will arrive before Thanksgiving this year. That's a really horrifying thought. The flagrancy of the violation of basic norms of international law represented by this invasion, and in addition to that, the daily toll of economic and human costs, have evoked the instinctive reaction that Russia should not only be defeated, but should be held accountable for what it has done. And one form of accountability is reparations. This evening, in the conversation that follows, we want to go beyond the immediate moral impulse and interrogate the legal, economic, and other aspects of the reparations issue as it relates to Ukraine. There are broadly three questions which we plan to address. The first is, going back to first principles, what does it mean to say that Russia is obliged to pay reparations? What does that mean? The second set of questions, how can it be compelled to pay? Compelled. And what are the obstacles and opportunities that arise? And thirdly, what next? What is the West doing? What is it not doing? What should it be doing? And what specific recommendations can we offer to policymakers? And it gives me enormous pleasure to introduce three influential and distinguished voices on all of these matters. To my far left, Tatiana Nesterchuk, a barrister and arbitrator. In plain English, that's top lawyer at Fountain Court Chambers. And we are very fortunate that she joins us from Ukraine, Katerina Busel, an associate professor at the National University of Kiev Mogila Academy. And finally, Lyra Nightingale, a legal advisor at Redress. It's a human rights organization that helps survivors of torture obtain justice and reparation. We'll speak for about 45 minutes or so. There'll be around half an hour Q&A, then drinks await. But if the conversation is so compelling that we should not stop it, I think we may find ourselves eating it as some drinking time. So let me begin by asking you, Tatiana, just as a top lawyer talking to what I assume are mostly non-lawyers, what do we mean by reparations? Just establish the foundations, what it is we're talking about. And what then does it mean to say that Russia owes reparations to Ukraine?
Thank you for that introduction, Nigel. I just want to say huge thanks to Europe House, to the ambassador for hosting us here and for supporting Ukraine in the way that you do. As a Ukrainian myself, huge thanks to you. And it feels very symbolic that we're here on the eve of US election when perhaps the fate of Ukraine and our existence will be determined. Now, returning to justice, without justice, I feel, we can't have the rule of law in Ukraine. And I always say what Ukraine needs is not charity or aid, it needs justice. And that's where this idea of reparations comes in. What are reparations? They're effectively restitution, compensation, satisfaction. These are the three tenets that are owed for various breaches of law. So there are different types of reparations. So states owe reparations to other states where they have breached some norms of international law. Now, I don't think anybody here would be surprised to hear that Russia has breached the most fundamental principles of our international law and order since World War II, since the creation of the UN Charter, which is the use of force against the territorial integrity and political independence of another state. That has been acknowledged by the UN General Assembly and also by the Parliamentary Assembly of the Council of Europe, both of which said that Russia must pay reparations to Ukraine. There is also another side to reparations. This in about 2005, again, the UN General Assembly adopted the basic principles and guidelines on the right to remedy reparations for victims of gross violations of international human law and serious violations of international humanitarian law. One can imagine there are plenty of those right now in Ukraine. Now, those reparations are payable to victims by the state where the events have occurred, so where victims live. And right now, and Katerina will talk in more detail about it, there are a lot of victims of human rights violations, of Russian war crimes in Ukraine, who need reparations urgently. And victims are not just people to whom bad things happen, they're also relatives of those people. So one can imagine how losing your parents will affect a child, but also having your mother undergo, or father undergo some horrific treatment at the hands of the Russian army will affect the children of the family. So those kinds of reparations, how in accordance with international law that Ukraine signed up to, have to be carried out right now whilst the war is ongoing, and the obligation falls on Ukraine. Russia will have to pay for that at some point, but until the offender pays, Ukraine will have to carry those out. And that, again, that will include things like compensation, which is paying for legal assistance, medical assistance, psychological and social services, rehabilitation, and satisfaction. Satisfaction, by the way, can also include things like the search for the whereabouts of the disappeared people, and we know there are plenty of people who have disappeared and not enough has been talked about. So we talk about the children, but also there are lots of just Ukrainians who are missing, not just from the army. So those are the two different obligations, and I don't think I need to go into further details, but one can imagine how it's a big responsibility for Ukraine to ensure that it complies with its international obligations while the war is ongoing.
Yeah, thank you. You've been very clear in emphasising the fact this is about justice. That, would you agree with this way of putting it? It's not merely a political demand, but a legal obligation under international law to pay compensation.
Yes,
That's a really important point.
Absolutely. It is a political obligation under international law, and an obligation that has been acknowledged at the highest level. So I would say UN General Assembly is probably the highest arbiter of international law breaches. And the particular resolution I'm talking about, which recognised Russia's need for accountability and payment of reparations, that was adopted almost 2 years ago, on 14th of November 2022, and 94 members voted in favour, only 14 voted against, although 73 abstained and 12 were absent. But the resolution is important as a recognition of Russia's international law obligations.
I think that's a really fundamental point to take away. It's about the foundations of international law. There's also another point you just touched on, which we may get to later, about the urgency of this. This is something that can be that should be looked at now, and not just when the war comes to an end, whenever that might be. But let's come back to that. Katerina, can I turn to you to drill down a little more detail about the range of things that Russia has done, the range of harms it has caused, that are proper objects of reparations claims. I think it's broader than a lot of people realise, and your illumination of this would be really helpful.
Good evening, dear colleagues. Thank you very much for the invitation and for this discussion and the question. I think what's really important from this discussion is to look at reparations and justice from the human-centric perspective, from the perspective of survivors. It's not just the rebuilding of Ukraine. And here I would like to present the quote from a new report by the UN Commission of Inquiry that does the documentation and the analysis of the most prevalent violations of the rules of warfare and human rights in the ongoing aggression. And I quote here, victims describe the physical and psychological pain and trauma, and emphasized the immense psychological challenges they face. The cases documented demonstrate that utmost disregard by the Russian authorities for physical integrity and human dignity. The violations of international law documented by numerous human rights NGOs, by the UN Commission of Inquiry on Ukraine, by the International Criminal Court's Office of the Prosecutor, include already mentioned today the deportation of Ukrainian children, the massive enforced disappearances of adult Ukrainian civilians, the widespread use of torture and inhuman treatment. And when we speak about the widespread or systematic violations, using the wording of international law, it speaks about crimes against humanity. And the UN Commission of Inquiry, whose report I've just mentioned, as well as the UN Special Rapporteur on Torture, have specifically singled out the crime of torture as something that Russia weaponizes on a widespread and systematic level. What does it mean? It means that in all the occupied areas where Ukrainian law enforcement, the military and human rights lawyers come after they're liberated, the more or less the same torture chambers are being discovered. The more or less the same tools of torture are being discovered, and the more or less the same torture techniques are being reported by the victims. They include the electrocution of genitalia of both women and men. They include the widespread forcing of family members watching the abuse, including the sexual abuse of their loved ones and including the abuse of their children. The human rights NGOs in Ukraine and the UN Commission of Inquiry also stress that Russia particularly weaponizes violence against people who are presumed to have a pro-Ukrainian position, people who oppose the occupation, people who have been members or are members of the military or of the civil society in the affected areas. And to sum it up, in the language of law, we can speak about the viable allegations of war crimes, the viable allegations of crimes against humanity, the viable allegations about the direct and public incitement to genocide, as well as genocide itself. Now, under international law, and I stress that this is a legal obligation, as Tatiana has mentioned, there's an obligation to restore the harms, the physical and mental harms done to these persons who have suffered human rights violations and these listed 3 core international crimes. And I would wind up here by just saying that there is also an important aspect of urgency. That is why within the spectrum of reparations, which Tatiana has kindly mentioned, restitutions, rehabilitation, guarantees of non-repetition and satisfaction, there's also a dimension of urgent interim reparations, because if we take a human-centric perspective, if we think about a victim of sexual torture in detention, this person, the harms, the physical injuries that they have incurred, the dental problems that they incur during the detention, the immense psychological trauma which they have, it cannot, the support with all these issues cannot wait until the end of the war. And later on, I'll be glad to speak about the initiatives which Ukraine has already undertaken together with international partners to support these people who have endured the immense psychological and mental suffering. Thank you.
Yes, Tatiana.
May I just add something? Just to add to what Katerina said and to explain the urgency, there's actually an international obligation that reparations are adequate, effective and prompt. And that is why we cannot wait for the end of the war. And that in itself, that's under the UN guidelines. And that is intended to promote justice. So the whole point of justice is that it's not delayed until the end of the 10-year, 20-year war. It is, the reparations are provided promptly. And the states are actually encouraged to establish national programs for reparations and assistance to victims in the event that parties liable for the harm suffered are unable or unwilling to meet their obligations.
Yeah, thank you. I'll just pick up 2 points that seem to me that very important from your remarks, Katerina. So the first is you really brought out how reparations are not only a material but a human fact. It's not only about rebuilding physical structures and schools and homes and power plants and stuff, but reparations are liable, are due, because of human harms that have been caused. And the second and related point is that, I mean, you described in eloquent and horrifying detail the crimes that have been committed against Ukrainians, torture and so on. And if I understood you right, that's not only a matter of criminal responsibility of those who carried out these actions and ordered them, but there is actually a financial or reparations implication in that as well. So there's some kind of nexus there.
If I may add just briefly here, the financial component, of course, is important because the dental treatment, this couple counseling, which survivors of sexual violence oftentimes request, it's all costly. But the very discussion that something is due to a person and the empowering participation of survivors in the design of reparations, in the advocacy for reparations and in their implementation is in and of itself already the assistance to them. I was stunned to tears this summer in The Hague when we had a big discussion on reproductive violence and reproductive harms, when a woman, a representative of SEMA Network Ukraine, this is an NGO of women survivors of conflict-related sexual violence, spoke publicly about the sexual and reproductive harms which Russia subjects onto Ukrainian males. So the whole idea that a survivor is empowered to fight for reparations for herself, but also that she as a woman brings up the harms, the acute gendered harms suffered by men who oftentimes shy away from speaking about the sexual violence they've endured in captivity. This in and of itself is very transformative and empowering. So while we should remember, of course, about the paramount financial aspect of reparations, I would not underestimate the groundbreaking underlying ethos of reparations, nothing for us without us, and the participation in the design of reparations is already supportive to survivors. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. So we have a clear sense now of the international legal foundation to reparations and some sense of the breadth of actions and harms that Russia has perpetrated that are subject to reparations. So now we move on to the question, how can Russia be compelled to pay? No one imagines they'd do so voluntarily. So how are these obligations enforced? What sort of finance or sources of money are we looking at? And a related question, how could anyone begin to calculate the extent of the financial weight of the reparations that Russia owes? Who would like to address that?
I can start with the legal point. How can the obligation be enforced? And the answer is we are in unprecedented territory, because really, historically, the obligation to pay reparations by a state to another state was enforced by consent, by agreement. And if Russia is going to refuse to pay, really there are no mechanisms right now that we have in existence to compel it to pay. For instance, partly because of its status, so it is one of the members of the Council of the UN, of the UN Council. So in that sense, the situation that happened after the Gulf War, where the UN Council mandated the establishment of the UN Compensation Commission, that cannot happen. So what happened then is that after UN Council mandate to establish the Compensation Commission, there was a decision to take 30% of Iraqi oil revenues and add those to the compensation fund, plus the US and I believe other countries also have seized Iraqi funds that were the Iraqi state funds, central bank funds that were available in their territory, and transferred those to the compensation fund as well. Now, that is not going to be possible in this case, and that's why we have resolutions of the UN General Assembly, but really nothing is happening because Russia is there blocking any decisions by UN. So UN is almost a defunct organ. The only other possible way of compelling that I can see is for the states, for the states who are on the side of Ukraine to come together and come up with a completely new mechanism. And this is something that, as we have heard an ambassador say, is already happening. So there's already a register for damages that was established by the Council of Europe. There are now discussions happening about the establishment of the Compensation Claims Commission. But in addition to the Compensation Claims Commission, there also has to be, right now, a discussion about the funding of the fund to pay the claims, because the funding for the Iraqi fund came from, as I said, oil revenues and the seized funds. And I suggest, and I think Lyra will talk about it further, that perhaps the seized Russian funds, which have been frozen, could be used as one way of repaying Ukraine at least some of the amounts. Now, we know that the amounts that are frozen, the CBR funds, are about 300 billion, with
the Central Bank of Russia.
This is the Central Bank of Russia, which is the amount that keeps growing, although not fast enough because it's mostly held in Euroclear, which can't invest them in particular. It invests them in very sensible instruments which don't produce a huge amount of interest. But even that not huge amount of interest has produced, as we know, a 50 billion loan for Ukraine right now. So the funds themselves, the 300 billion, could be used. That is not sufficient. I think you ask how can we measure the amounts that would be needed. The answer is it's almost impossible to tell, because the reparations we're talking about, the reparations to people, are the small part of the entire effort. There is also huge catastrophic effects on the environment that have been caused by the war. The landmines, that Ukraine will be the biggest territory by far covered in landmines by the end of this war. The reconstruction of the energy, the stolen art and everything else. So I think it's impossible to calculate those amounts. But there have been, I think the Ukrainian government has been calculating, and some of the international organizations as well. And all of those amounts are already far above 300 billion.
Thanks. Yeah, no, you touched on our favourite subject of frozen central bank assets. Larry, you may want to speak more about this or some related sources of funding for enforcing these
Yeah, sure.
claims.
Thank you very much. And as Tatiana has said, the monies that are out there alone, they're not going to be enough to fund the reparations. But as Tatiana's alluded to, that we have a distinction between frozen sovereign assets, so the Russian central bank assets and the assets of the Russian Federation, and the private frozen assets as well. And we don't know, there's a real lack of transparency around how much those assets are worth, but we think around 320 billion in sovereign assets, the vast majority of those being, as Tatiana alluded to, in Euroclear in Belgium, generating around 5 billion a year in interest. Some in the US, 5 or 6 billion, but again, it's not clear how much these are and where they are. And in terms of the private assets, we think roughly around 60 billion of private assets have been frozen since the war began in Western allied countries. And around, let's say around 20 billion of those in the UK. And there's a whole host of different ways that these monies could be used to go towards reparation or have reparative value. And again, we've heard briefly the outright confiscation of sovereign assets is a widely debated topic, whether that is something that is possible under international law, whether that should be done. There's a lot of fear around that with retaliation, financial security, whether that is in line with international law and the countermeasures. Some jurisdictions have gone further than others in relation to that, and we'll come on to that later. But aside from the actual sovereign assets themselves, there's then the proceeds generated by those assets. So the interest, but also the extraordinary revenues that are going back to Euroclear and sitting there, but which some jurisdictions have decided title doesn't belong to Russia for those assets, so they could be used to fund reparations. And we've heard how they're going to fund the G7 loan. And then when we're talking about the private assets, again, there's similar options on the table, so the outright confiscation, but also the forfeiture of those assets if they're linked to, say, criminal conduct or sanctions violations. The fines on sanctions violations are increasingly hefty that we've seen around the world, 20 million recently in Starling Bank. And then also a voluntary donation mechanism, which again I think we'll come on to later on, where those with frozen assets could voluntarily donate the proceeds of those assets for the benefit of reparation.
Okay, thank you. This is really important stuff. This gets to the sort of the practice of how we solve these challenges. And Tatiana, you uttered three important phrases I think to keep in mind. One was uncharted territory. The second is no precedence. And the third is new mechanisms. Now, that shouldn't necessarily scare us. It might scare some if there's no, as you say, the Iraqi precedent doesn't work. But it sounds like you're ready to say something. I just make the point that this war and the West's response to it has already been a great driver of innovation in other aspects of policy. And one example is the oil price cap. Another would be the freezing of Russia's central bank assets in February 2022. Nothing like that on this scale had ever been done before. So if those and other new things can follow from, again, the magnitude of the challenge, the threat that Russia presents, why not things in this matter as well? But you're poised and pounced and ready to strike, it sounds.
Well, I say unprecedented, but of course the law never stays still. The law always develops, and the countries develop the law as well. I've always said that the issue of compensation for Ukraine is not just a legal matter, but also a matter of political will and how far we are going to take the existing legal mechanisms and improve on them. I mean, this war in itself is completely unprecedented. The way this war is run is unprecedented because, you know, this is the first time we see a war that's run by drones and AI. So I don't see why the law has to stand still and not respond to the challenges which we are being faced with, which are unprecedented, frankly, and therefore the response in itself, I believe, has to be unprecedented, but based on examples from history which we can draw upon.
Anyone else want to add to this before we go on to the final kind of question, which is what governments are doing and what they should be doing that they're not doing? No? Okay, let's go on to that then. So we have a sense of the justification for reparations, a sense of the challenge, urgent challenge in developing new mechanisms to deal with it, and potential sources of funding, including at $300 billion, which I have strong views about actually, to work with Tatiana and others on this. So, but as of now, we drive towards the practical policy implications of this. What are Western governments, and perhaps Ukrainian government as well, doing, and crucially, what are they not doing that we would urge them to do as a matter of urgency? Who would like to start? Lara.
I can start us off with this one, and I will save the UK to the end because I think actually the UK is doing the least. But when we look at, for example, the States, we've recently seen the Repo Act, and what that does is it gives the president the authority to seize Russian sovereign assets to go to assistance for Ukraine. Now, that authority hasn't been acted on yet, so I don't know that it would be without moving as a group, but I see Tatiana's face. But what we are seeing at the moment is a needs assessment under the Repo Act of what is needed, with an assessment of the damages. And I urge the administration in that point to consider urgent interim reparations that we've heard from Katerina, so desperately needed. But the other interesting thing that they have in the States, which we don't have in the UK, is the Consolidated Appropriations Act. What that means is that when certain funds are forfeited, so in relation to sanctioned assets, it gives the power for the Attorney General to transfer those to Secretary of State to be applied for the benefit of Ukraine. So in a very simple summary, what that means is when they've gone through their judicial process, they can be then given to Ukraine. And we've seen that in, and I'm going to mispronounce the name here, but Malafiev case, where we saw $5.4 million going to Ukraine for the benefit of veterans of the war. So the US is already doing a lot more, or it has a legal basis to do a lot more than we do in the UK. And similarly in the EU, we've heard about the G7 loan and the up to 35 billion that the EU is going to provide through the extraordinary revenues. But we're also seeing now the new directives coming through in the EU that criminalise sanctions violations, and the directive, which isn't yet implemented, so states have got 2 years, but that say it encourages member states to redirect the proceeds of those confiscated assets for public interest or social purposes, or for example contributing to the register of damage. So moving slightly towards that more reparative element that we've not seen very much. So I'll pause on those two jurisdictions, I think.
Thank you very much. Katerina.
Thank you. Yeah, quite a few recommendations. In terms of urgent interim reparations, I would like to describe briefly the scheme which Ukraine is currently implemented and why it's not enough. So currently, urgent interim reparations in Ukraine are available only for 500 survivors and only for survivors of conflict-related sexual violence. It's a pilot project essentially to test run and test the procedure of how, in a non-traumatizing manner, survivors might be invited to report on the harms that they've incurred, how they might describe their situation, their needs, and how to better quantify the reparations which are due. These reparations are also limited. They are just 3,000 euros, which I can say, working with survivors of Russia's detention and other atrocities, it's just a drop in the ocean in terms of what's needed. So even the existent current scheme is very limited, and it has to be expanded first to victims of other crimes, to victims of torture, enforced disappearances, unlawful detention. And of course, these reparations should also be larger. 3,000 euros is not enough, but I must say that funding these reparations, redressing harms incurred by war crimes, is still far cheaper, far affordable than funding the rebuilding. So the procedure of getting the funds to ensure this direct support to survivors is actually much quicker than what we need for the broader spectrum of the reparations needed to rebuild Ukraine. Second, it's also important to ensure the already mentioned today design of the special tribunal to try Russia's aggression. As Tatiana has mentioned, the whole spectrum of harm incurred on Ukraine and Ukrainians is so immense that to quantify it through just singular war crimes, singular crimes against humanity is not possible. So it would be very important to have a ruling of an authoritative court that would look into this underlying crime of aggression and would pronounce what harm has been put on Ukraine through the crime of aggression and what reparation it must incur. And finally, both with the special tribunal, and today we already heard the register of damage for Ukraine, these are unparalleled mechanisms. And as a citizen, as a lawyer representing survivors, I'm deeply grateful to all the partners, to all the citizens globally supporting these initiatives. But I would like to stress that the register for damages covers damages incurred only since the full-scale invasion, and Russia's aggression started in 2014. It's paramount that both for Ukraine's rebuilding and for individual reparations to survivors, we look at the harms which have been caused since 2014 and not since the full-scale invasion. And that, of course, also strongly reshapes the amount of harms we're looking at. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Now, Tatiana, you'll have some thoughts on this, not least because you have some influence and sway in Parliament, and the Labour Party came to power on a manifesto commitment to seizing Russia's central bank assets, for example, but you may want to talk about other things as well.
I don't think I have influence in Parliament, I wouldn't say that, but what I have done in the past, one of my achievements was to draft the bill which has since not been introduced. We had a change in Parliament on the seizure of Russian state assets in support of Ukraine. And one of the act hasn't been passed, and in fact we have absolutely no legislation at all in the UK, and I think that's why we're lagging completely behind countries like US, which has the specific Repo Act, but also President there already had authority to seize state assets of other states. The countries like Canada, which in June 22 introduced a legislation to allow for seizure of both state and private assets, and even the EU, which has passed a special resolution concerning the profits from the frozen assets, mandating that those profits are not dissipated but are kept for the use, for the benefit of Ukraine. Now, we haven't done any of this, and I think the government recognises that they haven't done it. There was a recent debate in Parliament, 25th of October, where the Minister said, yes, we're committed to providing the 2.5 billion loan to Ukraine, as agreed by G7, but we will need some legislation to implement it. Absolutely they will, and they need to start thinking about it now. One of the things that I have drafted in my act, the first section, was the obligation to tell the government to produce the figures of what amounts are actually held. So this is something we don't know. The EU has stated what Russian state assets they have frozen. The US have been open about it, Canada, Canadians as well. But in the UK, we have no idea. We can guess it's about 20 billion, but we don't know. We also don't know what's happening to any profits or how much profits are made or which institution is holding those profits. And I think that in itself is remarkable. So I would really like to urge the government to deal with us transparently and to explain what precisely is being held here in Ukraine. I don't have in UK, because there is no reason for this secrecy. And if legislation is needed for that transparency, then that ought to be introduced together with legislation to enable the 2.5 billion loan. I think I'll stop there.
Yeah, thanks. Do you want to? Yeah, go on.
I might follow up a bit on what Tatiana said there. So, and she's made excellent points around the Russian state assets. But what's really remarkable to me is on top of that, there is no legislation for the fines coming out of the privately held assets. So we don't even have a legal basis to repurpose the civil, criminal and regulatory fines for the benefit of victims. And we're seeing those cases come through. So this year, the NCA reached an agreement, a forfeiture by consent for Peter Alvin. And it was, I say only, it was £750,000-ish. But that money goes back to the asset recovery incentivisation scheme. So effectively, it's going back to the Home Office, that money. And similar with the OFSI fines that we're seeing and the fines, the FCA fines. So we've had the smaller ones coming through related to Russia at the moment, but also the FCA fines are massive. So Starling Bank, 28 million, going back into the consolidated fund and not to Ukraine. And there is a mandate for that consolidated fund. It can potentially be given to charity, some of it. But I think the Financial Times did an FOI request last year to see if any of that money had gone to charity, and it hasn't. I think the last was in 2015. So millions and millions of fines and penalties being recovered and going straight back to the UK government, and none of it going to Ukraine. So we're very behind the US, for example, in that.
It's an important message, and it's a strange contrast, because on security issues, on sort of arming Ukraine, Britain's taken a relatively forward and strong position. But on aspects of economic matters, it's remarkably opaque. And that's a contradiction that shouldn't be allowed to stand. So if there's anyone from Whitehall here, something to think about. We do want to leave a little time for Q&A and a sort of conversation with the wider auditorium. I'll just conclude on a couple of very quick points that occurred to me in the course of this very rich conversation. The first is new mechanisms and new money was really a theme that came out very, very strongly here. That we are, as Tatiana said, in uncharted territory. So there's something new to invent here. And sources of finance, the scale of which we really haven't seen before in respect of the legitimate and justified reparations claims on Russia. And just very, very briefly on this $320 billion locked away in Western financial systems since doing nothing, essentially, since February 2022. The G7's position on this is most strategically illiterate I've ever seen. And it says, we will keep these assets immobilized until such time as Russia pays compensation to Ukraine. Well, as we know, that will never ever happen. So G7 policy on disposal of these assets, which is to say their eventual return to Russia, is based on the premise and assumption that can never come to pass. That is a completely self-defeating and nonsensical view, and the bold and urgent thing to do is just to take that money. Secondly, since the scale of the potential reparations claims we're looking at is so enormous and substantially exceeds even that $320 billion that might potentially become available, I raise this question, what are the implications for the future of any post-war relationship between the West and Russia? Would there be unpaid reparations claims hanging over Russia? And if not, why not? And thirdly and finally, again as a question, what new constellation of political forces might make solving these problems easier or harder? So to take some things that are predictably coming up. The Polish EU presidency begins at the beginning of next year. It's not the Hungarians, it's the Poles. That can only be good news on these matters. Secondly, the Canadians take over the G7. They've been pioneers on some of these issues, notably thinking about the seizure of their central bank assets. And thirdly, the great unknown is what happens tomorrow in the United States and the implications of that. With that, I'll open it up to the audience. We've probably got around 20, 25 minutes, depending on how urgently we want to drink. So Ed, I think, has already long ago flagged that he wants to offer a view or ask a question. So, Ed.
Thanks.
Hello, I'm Edward Lucas from the Times and SEPA. I was very interested to know from the panel what you think of the Finnish court decision in recent days, which is the first. This is about damage caused by Russia in the occupation and seizure of Crimea. I think it's $3.5 billion. It's an arbitration court judgment. And the Finns have been very quick to do this and seized 2 Russian properties in the strategically sensitive islands, which has attracted immediately graffiti on the Finnish embassy in Moscow. But I wonder what the significance is of what Finland's done, and if there's lessons we could learn from that. I'm also interested in the question of what we can do about the enablers in sanctions busting, whether we've got room for secondary sanctions on the behaviour that one might call awful but lawful, where there's no obvious criminal thing we can nail them for, but whether there's opportunities to inconvenience them with, for example, removing their right to visa-free travel to the United States or to Europe or to the European Union, so they'd have to go and apply for visas when they wanted to move around, or indeed any other options we have on secondary sanctions on enablers.
I'm happy to take the Finnish question. Now, that is a decision on enforcement of an existing arbitral award. So Naftogaz went to arbitration. I've actually been involved a little bit in it already, and they have got their arbitral award and they're enforcing it all over the world. So they have recognised their award here in the UK, but so far haven't managed to find any assets. They're doing the same in the US. And in Finland, they have found some assets against which this award was enforced by the Finnish courts. That isn't really an indication of what the Finns might do in terms of seizing assets for Ukraine in support of paying reparations to Ukraine or compensation to victims of war in Ukraine. That is a very straightforward application of Finnish law on enforcement of arbitral awards, and there's all sorts of rules about which property you can enforce arbitral awards against, and the sovereign immunity, etc., which I won't go into. So, as wonderful as it sounds, I think a lot of people probably are reading too much into it. It is very much a straightforward application of the law by the Finnish courts. I think there are probably sort of better ways of getting payments out of Russia, and I think actually the British government, the previous Conservative government, was being quite creative when they said, oh, how about we get the Russians to actually donate some funds, and we have the Abramovich's fund, which was set up on sale of Chelsea, which is 2.5 billion, which is still sitting there in a bank account somewhere here in this country, doing absolutely nothing. That amount is almost 3 times as large as the entire humanitarian assistance supplied by UK to Ukraine since the start of the full-time invasion. The government said that they provide about 937 million in humanitarian assistance so far to Ukraine. 2.5 billion, imagine how far that will go, and that is still sitting there doing nothing. So I think we can be, there are more creative ways. We don't have to go and hunting for Russian properties, although I'm sure people who are owed money by Russia under various judgments and arbitration awards against it are doing that. But Ukraine doesn't need to do that. There are funds available. We just need the political will to free them up.
Any more specific recommendations?
Just on Finland. Finland has also been in the news recently in relation to Justice for Ukraine for another reason. It indicted a person for war crimes allegedly perpetrated in Ukraine, and I just wanted to briefly address this dimension of justice and its relation for reparations. It's what's called universal jurisdiction proceedings, when a third country acts upon atrocity crimes perpetrated elsewhere just because they cannot go unpunished because they're so atrocious. So there has been the submissions to the German prosecutor, there have been the submissions to the French prosecution to open more of such cases, and Finland recently did so. Why is it symbolic? Why is it also relevant practically for reparations? Because such proceedings can result in arrest warrants, which of course, especially issued by a country in the EU or in the global south. For instance, Argentina has an immense experience in investigating and prosecuting forced disappearances. A, it's a legal ground to also freeze and repurpose private assets. B, it also narrows down the geography for traveling for potential or for alleged perpetrators. So Finland has also done an important indictment recently. Thank you.
Yeah, I agree with everything you said. And another thing the UK is notoriously bad at, using its universal jurisdiction. And I echo completely what you said on Chelsea. I mean, that money, like you said, 2.5 billion just sitting there, you can't give it away. The intention is there. Abramovich said exclusively for the benefit of all the victims of the war. We know that the foundation is for exclusively humanitarian purposes. 2.5 billion still sat there at an impasse, and we don't even know who is involved in the discussions, what the issues are with the granting of the license. So even when there's every intent to give that money away, it's still stuck. On the sanctions point, I think that's a really important point, and we know that the UK is notorious for dirty money, London in particular, the use of sanctions and enablers and sanctions evasions, and I think we see that in our law firms, in our banks, in our insurers. So I definitely think there's room for the UK to really work on how, first of all, it enforces sanctions and thinks about enablers.
Okay, let's take a couple of questions. There's one here, and one over there. Yeah, look it up. Yes, very good.
Thank you. I'm Igor Ardievich. I'm one of the trustees of the Institute. Tatiana, she modestly didn't say that. So as a trustee, thank you to the panelists for your valuable contribution. I have two questions. One, legal one. We talk here about reparations. Is there in legal a concept of punitive damages that sometimes is applied in private law? My second question is more of a comment. There's been a couple of times mentioned in the discussion that 320 or whatever billions is not enough, and that Russia will not pay further monies in the future, which I don't dispute. I don't understand, however, maybe there's been work done or analysis done on why do we not tax the flow of commodities, gas or even other things, that illegally the Hungarians are still buying Russian gas that flows to Ukraine, and B, in contravention of sanctions, continues to flow, and that's the reality we have to accept. And by taxing that at the purchaser level, and by setting a tax in an economic manner which makes the purchaser actually interested to pay the tax. For example, the Indians may be willing to pay some amount of money to legalize what they buy from the Russians. We can, and there's all sorts of other flows that we can tax at the buyer source. Why do we not do that? Has that work been done? And isn't that one way of finding some money? Thank you.
Okay, and there was a question here.
Hello? Yeah, Godfrey Cromwell from the House of Lords, but I'm speaking personally. First of all, I wish we stopped talking about Russia must lose. It plays straight into the hands of the Russian propagandists. It's the regime. I have many Russian friends. I'm sure many people in this room have Russian friends. It is not about Russia losing the war. It is about the regime. My second point is that 20 years ago, well, argue with me later. 20 years ago, we were friends with Russia. 20 years from now, we may be friends with them again. And we may have some interesting two-sided legal action about people who say they were nothing to do with the war, but you took my resources, you took my money. Taking the interest is one thing, but you took my assets. The lawyers in Russia are going to get pretty busy with that too. And finally, a historic point, the imposition of very severe reparations was one of the major causes of the Second World War. If Russia bankrupts itself fighting this war, and then go after them for further reparations, it's going to be an interesting one. I agree with almost everything that's been said by the panel tonight. But I just want to put those three thoughts, because sometimes you're preaching to the choir and somebody needs to raise a different point of view. Thank you.
I can speak briefly to that point. I think it's a really interesting point, and one we will hear a lot, and you're absolutely right about the post-World War II context. I think the difference between the duty that you owe reparations and paying them are two different things. So let's say there's a change in regime, an acknowledgement that there's a duty on that country that they owe the reparations isn't the same as enforcing them to pay the reparations. If there was, for example, a political context where, exactly like you said, it might be for the benefit of Ukraine or for the West to enter into a more collaborative relationship, say, with a new regime, a country that will have already been choked by sanctions and the cost of its war, then that decision may be taken down the line. Who knows? That there is that the bill shouldn't be settled in full, but that's not the same as acknowledging that there is a huge bill and a legal right for that to be settled, I think is how I'd answer that point.
I would just add to this idea that Russia will be bankrupted. Now, let's just remember that Russian annual budget is about $390 billion a year, dollars. 40% of that approximately goes on this war. Russia is bankrupting itself by carrying on this war. Ukraine will need a small, in the large scheme of Russia's spending during this war, Ukraine will need a small percentage of money. Russia's CBR assets, which is the only assets we're talking about seizing, about $320 billion US dollars. They've been frozen since the beginning of full-scale invasion, so close to 1,000 days. Russia has not felt the absence of that money, so I really don't believe that by taking that money and transferring it to Ukraine, we will be bankrupting Russia. Speaking about Russia versus Russian regime, I think it is fair to say that the Russian regime was chosen by the Russian people, and the majority of them are supporting the war. I know that there are some who are not, and who are daring to speak out about it, which is very courageous. But unfortunately, the majority of them are supporting the war, and I think some education and re-education will have to be done, just like it was done after the Second World War as well. We can't just go back to business as usual and being friends. So I think that's really important. In terms of kind of Igor's question, can you put punitive reparations? The law is that the reparations must be proportionate to the crimes. So I don't think you're punishing somebody. You are just looking for compensation, restitution for victims. So I don't think you're looking to punish anyone. You're just looking to put the victims back in a position that they would have been had the atrocities not happened. And the tax idea, I mean, I totally agree with you, Igor. I've also had, in terms of financing Ukraine, I've just spoken about the amounts of money that Russia is spending on the war. Ukraine is spending a huge amount less. I think Ukraine has, in 2024, it's got about 40 billion in its budget to spend on the war, and it said that it needs another 40 billion from its partners, effectively, to support it. And that would take it to about 80 billion. Still a big shortfall from the amounts that Russia is spending on this. So I think the idea of a tax would actually be really helpful in terms of providing funding to Ukraine, and funding which will not be dependent on the various political issues that we're facing. If we have this constant source of funding for Ukraine, which will not depend on who wins the US election, who is the next president in the EU, or the G7. I think that would be incredibly helpful. I totally agree that we need to think about taxing revenues that are coming from trade with Russia. I've also got a few figures here about the taxes that are still paid in Russia by Western companies that are continuing to trade there. I'm not sure whether against sanctions, probably. But I think B for Ukraine estimates that there is no reporting, and Russia stopped reporting the corporate taxes that it receives, but the estimate is that in 22-23 about $20 billion annually was paid by Western businesses into Russian taxes. So that's 20 billion that is supporting the war machine. My idea would be to say, okay, if you're going to carry on doing business with Russia, you've got to pay twice the amount that you're paying in Russian taxes into a fund for Ukraine. And imagine that could raise, well, either it will encourage businesses to stop doing business with Russia, so it will take the money out of Russia, or it will raise 40 billion for Ukraine to spend on military support. I mean, completely outside the taxpayers' fund that we're now contributing. So I'm completely in favour of some creative ideas to raise money, including from trade revenues.
Two comments, if I may, with respect to the Russian regime and the perpetrators. I specifically started my intervention with a quote from the UN Commission of Inquiry, not from a human rights NGO from Ukraine, which some people could say could be too activist. The UN Commission of Inquiry specifically has stated that direct perpetrators, ordinary foot soldiers, exhibit immense violence and dehumanization towards the Ukrainians. So it's not just the leadership or the commandment. And when we speak about the reparations, I think the period that we should look at is not the post-World War I period, but the post-World War II period. And the processes of the denazification and the vetting that have been conducted in Germany since the World War II, and that addressed its judiciary, its prosecution, and its academics who were implicit and complicit in the Nazi regime. And when Mr. Piotrovsky, who allegedly is an academic and a person who heads Hermitage, says that we're all militarists and imperialists, it's a strong sign from the academic community, it's a strong sign from the museum community that they endorse the policy of the government. So I think the processes that we should look at are the denazification, which the Russian civil society would strongly benefit from. Unlike the Belarusian civil society, they haven't exhibited the same level of resilience and opposition to their authorities. Thanks.
Tax is an intriguing idea. The problem is it's been massive trade diversion away from the West as a consequence of the war and sanctions. So most of Russia's trade now is with countries whom it's hard to imagine would voluntarily impose a tax on the trade that they're getting. In the Western exports are down 80%, imports down 60%, something like that. Maybe there's still something to tax, but as sanctions packages accumulate, then there's less and less.
You cannot have that and a $60 cap that the Americans invented. So if you think a $60 cap works, then a tax works. If a $60 cap doesn't work, you have to change it. The logical thing.
Well, I mean, the problem there is that the West is importing almost no Russian oil now, and is going elsewhere.
Importing some, that's not correct. But also some of them, I would challenge you. I agree that the Chinese are likely to pay, but I'm not sure about people like the Indians and so on that are in between. If you have a small enough tax, they may be willing to do that to legalize it, because at the end they still need the American system.
I hope you're right, and maybe it's something to put to the Indian government. Just finally on, I mean that seriously, not this issue. And just finally on the question about how you distinguish a country from its regime, and therefore what's the distinction between defeating a country and defeating a regime? Well, it raises a question. How do you defeat the regime without defeating the country? And on the matter of whether we were friends with Russia, or when we were friends with Russia, I'm not sure 20 years ago, perhaps 30 years ago, but the point there is that Russia was best disposed towards us when it was weakest. And indeed when it had lost a war, which is to say the Cold War. That was when we enjoyed our best relationship with it in the 1990s. So we've got time for a couple more questions. It's a very gendered, so there's most of the audience is women, most of the questions are for men. So Are there any women willing to ask a question? There's one at the back there. Very good. Very good. Far away.
Thank you. I'm Yulia Yofa from UCL. I have a question for Katerina, but perhaps others can contribute as well. I have a question about urgent reparations. And I understand that it's very much led by the civil society in Ukraine. And because we talked about a lot of unprecedented things, solidarity has been also unprecedented, including from other countries. And from what I know, urgent reparations already have been introduced in other jurisdictions in some African countries, perhaps not with regard to sexual violence, but other things. So I just wondered what was the process, was there cooperation or influence of other jurisdictions, and whether you are encouraged in terms of implementation based on the experience from other countries. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Julia. The design of urgent interim reparations in Ukraine engages several partners. First and foremost, these are the survivors. I mentioned SEMA Network Ukraine, so it's very survivor-led. It's also the leading human rights NGOs in Ukraine, such as the Association of Ukrainian Women Lawyers, Yurfem, the government, and on the international side, the partners from Redress, but also Global Survivors Fund. The Global Survivors Fund is an NGO established by Dr. Denis Mukwege and Nadia Murad, the two Nobel Peace Prize laureates who received the prize for combating sexual violence as a weapon of war. And indeed, as Yulia has pointed out, they support the development of reparations in many countries globally, not just in Africa and Latin America. Because there is such an international actor in this policy making, indeed the best practices from other contexts are infused. But even the partners from Global Survivors Fund state that Ukraine is now setting a precedent in terms of designing and implementing urgent interim reparations while the atrocity situation is ongoing. Usually it has been still much later. And here we're hoping that it will be a positive precedent for other countries first. And second, we haven't raised the issue of the global north, global south dynamics. Reparations and transitional justice, of which reparations is a part of, is a great spectrum for the space for dialogue between Ukraine and Ukrainian survivors and partners from the global south. So here is also the positive room for change.
Yeah, thank you. And just to echo what Katerina said, so the Dr. Denis Mukwege's and Global Survivors Fund initiative, they're learning exactly, as you say, from the experiences in other contexts. So I think they've had exchanges where survivors from the DRC have gone to Ukraine. They're learning a lot from Colombia to try and pull this rape as a weapon of war, and how can we really engage in meaningful reparations and support for that based on what a huge precedent it is, and it still is, as rape as a weapon of war. And so there's a lot to be done, I think, but it is great that these organisations are linking up and that they exist, but as we know, still so far behind.
One final Chris question.
Hello, I'm Luke. Thank you for the talk tonight. I was just going to ask, how do we ensure we leverage Russia to go for a complete demilitarization and denuclearization? Because we all know they should never be trusted to have an army again, let alone nuclear weapons. And that would just save them so much money that could all be used for these reparations.
I am not qualified to answer that question, so I'm going to pass.
Yeah, I agree. I don't think this is a question for Admiral. I mean, we're not military specialists. I have no idea how you encourage a country which has no interest in demilitarization in doing so, other than by completely destroying it, which is obviously not something Ukraine intends to do.
Okay, it just remains for me to thank you all for coming this evening and for a wonderful discussion, which I hope will continue over drinks, and above all to thank our wonderful panel. Tatiana.